House Leader of Third Party.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. It's great to be back in debate for this important bill after our spring session was so abruptly cancelled by COVID in March. Unfortunately, as with so many issues over the last 3 months, things have worsened amidst pandemic conditions. As reported by crisis and support centres, rates of sexual assault and domestic violence in British Columbia increased as stay-at-home and social distancing orders came into force. While we collectively follow the guidelines of the Provincial Health Officer, staying isolated in our homes as much as possible, it's clear that keeping the wider population safe from COVID-19 has increased the risk for some of our most vulnerable citizens. Women and children have been at increased risk of experiencing or witnessing domestic violence during this time, with limited ability to leave an unsafe situation or access their support networks. This risk is exacerbated by economic hardship and uncertainty. I can speak, Honourable Minister, of the commercial that plays regularly where women are shown how to give a hand signal over Zoom or Skype to indicate that they're in danger in their homes. And every time I see that commercial, I'm wrenched by that experience of imagining what it must be like in these conditions. Noting this, the provincial government responded by supplementing current shelter spaces with additional accommodations in hotels, working with the sexual assault centres and shelters to increase services, and coordinating with the federal government, who announced an additional $40 million for women's shelters and sexual assault centres, with $10 million invested in emergency shelters meant to benefit Indigenous women and children needing to flee unsafe situations. There's also been additional media coverage on this issue, which is important for awareness and combating stigma, and crisis phone, email, text services set up to support people. While an immediate response to these concurrent crises is needed to keep people safe in the short term, as policymakers, we need to address the root causes of domestic and gender-based violence. We need to create solutions not just for women and children fleeing violence, but for the perpetrators of violence themselves. Intergenerational trauma, economic uncertainty, lack of social networks, substance dependency all contribute to domestic violence, and we should strive to create support and perpetrator accountability systems that help move us forward as a society away from violence and abuse. In that regard, I support this bill because it works to address a structural aspect of this issue, that survivors of violence and abuse can be further harmed by a system and society that does not support or facilitate their recovery. Bill 5 amends the Employment Standards Act to provide a new employer-paid leave of up to 5 days for employees experiencing or who have specific family members experiencing domestic or sexual violence. It builds upon the unpaid job-protected domestic or sexual violence leave this government introduced for employees last year, and represents further progress on our commitment to support individuals experiencing this type of violence. This change will help people who have faced domestic or sexual violence by giving them a bit of time and space to address their most pressing needs, as so wonderfully articulated by the member from Burnaby North, describing her personal experience as a support worker. This may mean getting medical, psychological, and legal support, or it could mean that they have the time to find a new place to live or a new school for their children without having to lose their job or financial security in the process. These amendments will modernize BC's employment standards and bring our laws to protect workers in line with other jurisdictions. The immediate aftermath of an assault is horrific enough as it is. Survivors should not have to also worry about sacrificing their livelihood to attend to a crisis that someone else created. I'd also like to recognize that the shift to include victims of sexualized violence, in addition to domestic abuse survivors, was instigated last year by the official opposition and is central to the strength of this policy. As we advance solutions, we must also always be careful to not inadvertently create a hierarchy of victims that leaves those who are assaulted by someone other than their partner without the services they need and deserve just as much as people in relationships. And while today's progress is worth celebrating, we must continue to work to reduce and better respond to instances of sexualized and gender-based violence in our province. The decision by multiple governments over many decades to consistently underfund the medical and justice services needed by survivors of sexualized violence is inherently sexist and dangerous to women. We have a long way to go. According to government's data, roughly 2/3 of those who have faced domestic violence in Canada are women. 1 in 4 of sexual assault victims were children aged 13 and younger. 3 to 5 children in every classroom are exposed to domestic violence. Indigenous women and girls are 3.5 times more likely to face violence than non-Indigenous, and LGBTQ2S+ people are more than twice as likely to experience violence than the rest of the population. I'd also like to acknowledge, Honourable Speaker, 2 related tragedies that have happened since we left this House in March. The horrific mass murder inflicted in the Maritimes in April, and the appalling crime committed in my caucus colleagues' riding earlier this month. The day after the news about Nova Scotia broke, my heart sank when I learned that the perpetrator began with an attack on his partner. This means that one of Canada's worst tragedies is yet again connected to domestic violence. Misogynistic beliefs underlie all of the worst mass shootings that have taken place in Canada in my lifetime. The 1989 Polytechnique shooting is the most infamous. The Toronto van attack perpetrator was radicalized by online incel subculture, and in addition to his racist, anti-Muslim views, the Quebec mosque shooter routinely attacked feminists online. The latter 2 have not been widely discussed in the context of violent misogyny. This is a mistake. By failing to examine the underlying toxic views of the perpetrators, we are ignoring a critical aspect of these crimes. Larger scale analyses confirm this pattern. An analysis of FBI data on mass shootings found that 57% of mass shootings between 2009 and 2015 included a spouse, a former spouse, or other family members among the victims. We need to be vigilant and uncompromising even when the behavior doesn't yet constitute outright physical abuse. Violence exists on a spectrum. People who know the Nova Scotia shooter say that his jealous treatment of his girlfriend was a red flag. Indeed, experts say that misogynistic treatment of women and other family members by a perpetrator is often observed before it escalates to mass violence. Before the perpetrators terrorize society, they terrorize those who are closest to them. The responsibility for combating misogyny must be shared by everyone. We all need to speak out when we encounter instances of misogyny, educate ourselves, and build the underlying conditions that support gender diversity and inclusion. We need to do all of this urgently, and we need to do it all the time, not just in the wake of a tragedy. In particular, we need to see more proactive efforts from men. People of marginalized genders have long been at the forefront of fighting to address gender-based violence, taking on the work of advocating for policy change and building victim support organizations. Men need to show that they are united in the fight for equality, especially by fostering alternative visions of masculinity that are not tied to the control or domination of others. This need not be a daunting task. The majority of men already model equitable treatment of others, and much progress towards equality has been made. As we all embrace more learning and open dialogue, we will build a society where everyone can enjoy a healthy sense of identity that doesn't diminish or threaten anyone else. Likewise, women with privilege must go above and beyond to center the experiences of women who face compounding threats, such as those associated with racial discrimination and poverty. By sharing the responsibility for combating gender-based violence and discrimination, we will all share the rewards of a more peaceful, equitable province. I thank the members of this House for their collaboration on this important bill, and I trust we will continue working together to advance systemic solutions to the systemic discrimination facing women. Thank you.